But it's turned out to be the first talk where I spent the morning on the beach. So, good, I can see that the humor is working through the headsets. That's very important. On a more serious note, this is my first talk after 10 months of treatment for an aggressive thyroid cancer. Now I'm fine, but it left one of my vocal cords paralyzed. A year ago, if I'd come here a year ago, I would have delivered this talk without a microphone at all, and you would have heard me just fine. And now I have to sort of relearn public speaking. So if I sound hoarse, or if I stumble a little, it's because I'm sort of like a musician relearning my main performance instrument, or an athlete sort of relearning how to play the game after an injury. So I apologize for a slightly subdued format. Instead of heavy metal shrieking, you're going to get crooning. So today's talk is drawn from my book, MP3, The Meaning of Format, which is forthcoming from Duke University Press in 2012. And if anybody wants to translate it into Portuguese, I'd be more than happy. Now the MP3, as you know, is, as you probably know, is a kind of file format for sound recordings. And MP3s are the most common form of recorded sound in the world. There are more MP3s in circulation worldwide than all other formats combined. And this is really for one reason and one reason only, and that is, if you imagine a song on a CD, you take the same song and you make an MP3 version of it. That MP3 on average is about 12% of the song on the compact disc. Now, once you have a much smaller file, you can cram many more of them onto a CD. You can fit many more on a hard drive. They're easier to transmit over the internet, and they're easier to compile, store, share, and so on and so forth. And so it's really the small size that's made them so popular and so universal today. Now, most people have written about most people that have written about MP3s, and I'm speaking here both of scholars and journalists, have written about them from one of two perspectives. Either from worries about sound quality, in other words, that MP3s are of lower sound quality than the WAV files one finds on a CD, and that this is somehow signaling the end of civilization. Or they're worried about file sharing and systematic violation of copyright by now, millions of people around the world. And while I am interested in both those things, and I do talk about them in the book, and by the way, whatever I covered today in my talk, you can pretty much in the question and answer ask me anything about MP3s, and even if I don't know anything about it, I'm sure I'll have an opinion. But I'm interested in the MP3 for different reasons than sound quality or file sharing. The main reason I'm interested in the MP3 is because each file, this is how I got interested in the project actually, each file carries with it the imprint of a theory of human hearing, or rather its gaps or absences, and I'll explain how that is and how that works in a minute. So basically, you could say that the proliferation of MP3s is a kind of epic poem about human hearing, conducted or propagated by millions of people on the internet. I'm also interested in the MP3 as a media historical problem. Now, when people talk about music, media, and especially musical media, they tend to talk about them in terms of boxes, equipment, right? So we talk about iPods or compact discs or LPs. They're in terms of really tangible objects. But it turns out, and this is not just true in sound media, but I think in media more generally, that formats are also a central understudied axis of media and culture. Certainly, formats are hugely important to musical history, right? Both a 45 and a 33 are a kind of record, and yet they are used very differently and listened to very differently. So the conceit of my book is that it's a 90-year history of the MP3 format, which is quite a trick since the format itself is only 18 years old. And it's really of three intertwined problematics. The encounter between ears and media in the 20th century, the political and cultural economy of sound technology in that same period, and finally rethinking media history via formats. So today's talk is an excerpt from the intro to the book, which I've entitled Format Theory, and not surprisingly, it's about the importance of formats. And I also will do a little bit to consider the sonic protocols of the MP3, and we'll have a little fun with that. Now, the phrase format theory is a tweak on the phrase medium theory, which is a term originally developed by Canadians like Marshall McLuhan, who coined the famous adage, the medium is the message, and has recently been repopularized by German media theorists, most notably Friedrich Kittler. And so I'm going to share with you a quote from two of Kittler's translators, Michael Woods and Jeffrey Winthrop Young. And I'll give you a chance to read it and the translators to translate it, and then I'll talk about it. All right, so now, having given that quote to you, I'm going to undermine it immediately. I'm always wary of people who say we should all study this or that, because I'm more methodologically pluralist than that, and I don't actually think everybody who studies stuff should do it the way I do it. So I'm not quite ready to throw out, literature and anthropology and everything else in the study of media. But I do like the term mediality. And it points to a central condition of music and sonic experience today. And that is that sonic media tend to reference other sonic media. When you read people who write sort of history and theory of communication, there's often a tendency to frame the development of media in terms of mediation. In other words, that a medium mediates a prior or previously existing relationship. So in other words, recorded music for these people would be seen as kind of a debased form of live performance. But I don't actually think that's the case. I think that we live in a world, in fact, where media are very much a normal part of everyday experience and not a spectacular rupture of more primal or primary face-to-face interaction. And so I like the term mediality a lot because it suggests a condition rather than interference or a mutation of a previously existing relation. So that's the term. Now I'm going to introduce the MP3 to you a little bit. I mentioned before an MP3 is a kind of file format. And they're made through a process called data compression. Now, for those of you who are audio nerds, you know that compression means 5 different things depending on what we're talking about. And I'm specifically talking about the process of making a file as small as possible. MP3s basically depend on the medium and the listener to make up the difference for the data that they throw out. So I'm going to show you a picture here which now, I'm not going to explain the whole picture, and please don't let it make your head explode with all the signal flow charts and stuff. But you'll see that there's a big, thick path that audio travels through, and then thinner lines that show where the things that control the audio. And I'm particularly interested in the box in the upper left-hand corner. That one right there. Basically what happens is an MP3 encoder takes a CD quality file, takes a file, like when you put a CD into your computer and rip it to your hard drive, it goes through something that works kind of like this. The first thing it does is it removes the non-redundant data. Now, when you do this to an audio file, it gets smaller, but it doesn't get that much smaller. And so this is where perceptual coding comes in. It removes the part of the signal that it thinks you won't hear anyway. And it does this through, because of theories in psychoacoustics about human hearing. Basically, the idea is that the frequency response of our hearing changes in the presence of different sounds. And you might think about it like cars on a highway. Two cars can't occupy the same lane. And psychoacousticians have a term for these lanes. They call them critical bands. And if a critical band is filled up with signal and sound, then it can't, other sounds that aren't as loud simply won't be heard. And so what an MP3 encoder does is it tries to guess which sounds are filling up the critical bands and getting rid of the frequencies that aren't. So let me give you some examples of how this works. And the picture is going to disappear for just a minute, but it'll come back.